My friends, there comes a moment in every seeker's life when the old way of living can no longer sustain us. A moment when we discover, often through struggle, that no amount of human planning, no amount of personal effort, no amount of mental striving has given us the peace, the harmony, or the fulfillment we have been seeking. And so we arrive here not by accident, not by chance, but by an inner impulse, an impulse of the Spirit itself, drawing us to a deeper truth. You see, the great turning point of the spiritual life is not the moment we decide to become better people, nor the moment we adopt new practices, nor even the moment we dedicate ourselves to prayer. The true turning point comes when we awaken to the startling realization that we have been trying to live life through a self that was never equipped to live it. The personal sense of self, that little me that worries, fears, plans, controls, has tried to carry the entire burden of existence upon its shoulders. And because it is limited, because it is finite, because it was never the source of life, it has inevitably come to exhaustion. Now, I want you to hear this clearly, because the world has missed it. The spiritual path does not begin when you try harder. It begins when you can no longer continue as you have been. It begins when you realize that there is a presence within you that has been waiting patiently, silently, lovingly for you to step aside. A presence that does not need your strength, that does not require your intelligence, that does not depend upon your human understanding, a presence that is the very life of God, the very life of Christ, expressing itself as your consciousness. And so in our time together, we are going to explore what actually happens deep within the chambers of your being when you finally allow this presence to take its rightful place. When you cease living from the personal mind and begin living from the Christ mind. When you stop striving to make life work and begin resting in the life that already is. Not theory, not philosophy, but the actual experience of the divine living. Its life is you. If you can receive this, if you can hear it, not with the intellect, but with that inner listening that responds to truth, something will begin to shift even now. For when truth is spoken, the Christ within each of us recognizes itself, and in that recognition, transformation begins. Now, let us move deeper into this principle, for before we can understand what it means to let Christ live our life, we must first see clearly what has been living our life until now, and this, perhaps more than anything else, is the great stumbling block in spiritual realization. Our unexamined identification with a self that is not the self. From early childhood, we are conditioned to believe that we are a separate being, an isolated mind, a vulnerable body, a personal identity struggling to survive in a threatening world. We learn to say, I must do this. I must achieve that. I must protect myself. I must make my life work. And without noticing it, we become prisoners of this personal I, this finite sense of self that is constantly planning, worrying, resisting, defending. But the personal self is not your true identity. It is not the Christ. It is not the divine. It is not the presence that Jesus spoke of when he said, I and the Father are one. It is, in truth, a mental image, an accumulation of beliefs, memories, fears, and reactions. It has no spiritual substance. It has no divine authority. It has no reality in the kingdom of God. And yet, this is the self we have been living from. This is the self we ask to solve our problems. This is the self we expect to guide us, protect us, heal us, and supply us. And then we wonder why life feels heavy. why fear clings to us, why peace eludes us. We wonder why our prayers seem unanswered, why our spiritual efforts bear so little fruit. The answer is astonishingly simple. We have been attempting to live life through a self that is not alive in God. The separate self has no access to the infinite because it is built upon the belief in separation. The personal mind cannot touch the divine because it is formed out of the very belief that the divine is somewhere else. So, listen carefully. All fear arises from the illusion of separation. All lack arises from the illusion of separation. All sickness, all anxiety, all striving arise from the illusion of separation. When you believe yourself to be a separate entity, living by your own power, sustained by your own strength, you place yourself outside the kingdom of God, not in truth, but in your own perception. And from that moment on, life becomes a struggle, because the self you are living from is disconnected from the source of life. But the miracle is this: the separate self is not something you must conquer or improve. It is something you need only see through. The moment you recognize its unreality, its power dissolves. The moment you perceive that it is not the one living your life, it falls away like a shadow disappearing before the sun. And in that instant, a new awareness begins to dawn, an awareness not born of effort, but of revelation. There is another self within you, a self that is whole, complete, infinite, untouched by human limitation, a self that is not separate from God, because it is the activity of God itself. This is the Christ. This is the one true self. This is the life that is waiting to live as you. And so now, having looked upon the nature of the personal self, we must turn to the reality that has always been present behind it, the reality the world has called Christ, though the world has seldom understood what that word truly means. If we are to let Christ live our life, we must know what Christ is, not intellectually, not theologically, but as inner recognition in the infinite way. When we speak of Christ, we are not speaking of a person. We are not referring to a historical figure, though such a figure may have embodied the principle. We are speaking of the divine presence that is the true identity of every individual on earth. The Christ is the light of God expressing itself as your consciousness. The Christ is the fullness of divine life, living you, breathing you, sustaining you. The Christ is the truth of your being unborn, undying, untouched by human circumstance. It may help to see it this way. Just as the sun shines, whether the clouds appear or not, so the Christ shines as the essence of your being, whether the personal self recognizes it or not. When the clouds thicken, clouds of fear, guilt, self-judgment, or worldly belief, the light seems hidden, but the Christ remains just as radiant, just as present, just as whole. You have never lived a moment without it. You have never taken a breath apart from it. The Christ is not something you acquire. It is something you discover. Now, hear this with the inner ear. Christ consciousness is not a higher level of your personal mind. Christ consciousness is the absence of your personal mind. It is the state in which the personal I, with all its fears, ambitions, doubts, and demands, grows quiet, and the divine I begins to reveal itself. Christ consciousness is the recognition that the life you have been calling your life is not yours at all, but God's life expressing itself as your individuality. It is the dawning realization that you are not a human being seeking God. You are God appearing as a human being, momentarily unaware of your origin. And the moment awareness returns, the moment you touch even a whisper of this truth, something shifts. You begin to sense a presence within you that is not limited, not frightened, not striving. This presence does not reason. It does not fear. It does not struggle. It does not pray to God for. It is the activity of God. It does not seek supply for. It is the outflow of infinite supply. It does not heal, for it is the wholeness that reveals the unreality of disease. When you touch this presence, even briefly, life begins to reorient itself. The mind grows quieter. The heart feels lighter. You no longer feel alone in the universe. You no longer feel responsible for the entire burden of existence. You begin to sense that there is a divine rhythm, subtle, gentle, but unmistakable, moving your life forward with infinite intelligence. And the most important truth of all is this. This Christ, this presence, this divine consciousness is not waiting to enter your life. It is waiting to be recognized. It is the reality that has been living you from the beginning, but the personal self has stood in front of it like a curtain blocking the sunlight. Pull back the curtain, and you discover that the light was there all along. So when we speak of letting Christ live your life, we are speaking of removing nothing and adding nothing. We are speaking of a shift from illusion to truth, from separation to oneness, from personal effort to divine expression. We are speaking of the revelation of what you have always been. Now, having glimpsed the nature of the Christ within, we come to one of the most sacred moments in the entire spiritual journey, the moment of surrender. Not the surrender the world imagines, not defeat, not resignation, not the giving up of hope. No, the surrender we speak of in mystical practice is entirely different. It is the quiet realization that the personal self has no role in the divine life that is unfolding as you. There comes a time, perhaps you have already felt it, when all the effort, all the struggle, all the attempts to improve, correct, or control your experience reach their limit. You discover that no matter how sincere your striving has been, it has not opened the gate to peace. And in the exhaustion of that striving, something holy begins to take place. A softening, a release, a willingness to stop leaning on your own understanding. This is the moment when the inner voice whispers, "I cannot do this anymore." And far from being a failure, that whisper is the beginning of grace. For in that very admission, you cease trying to live life according to the laws of the personal mind, and you enter the atmosphere where the Christ can reveal itself. You see, the personal self tries to make things happen. The Christ allows things to unfold. The personal self reacts to conditions. The Christ stands still in the presence of conditions. The personal self fears the future. The Christ lives in eternal now. The personal self seeks protection. The Christ is protection. When you come to the end of the personal self, when it can no longer carry the burden, you are not falling into emptiness. You are falling into God. You are falling into the arms of the presence that has been carrying you since before you drew your first breath. And what makes this surrender sacred is that it is not something you perform, it is something that happens to you. It is not something you force, it is something you allow. This surrender may come as a deep breath that loosens the chest. It may come as a moment of stillness in the midst of panic. It may come as a sudden recognition, I don't have to figure this out. It may come as an inner voice saying, be still and know. But however it comes, it always carries the same fragrance, the fragrance of rest. Not the rest of inactivity, but the rest of trust. Not the rest of escape, but the rest of realization. The rest that comes when the false sense of self yields and the true self begins to shine through. And let us understand this clearly. Christ does not enter your life because you surrender. Christ is revealed because surrender removes the veil. Christ has been living your life all along. But the personal sense of self has been pretending otherwise. The moment you stop trying to live life through the personal mind, a subtle, quiet presence begins to emerge. You feel guided without thinking. You feel supported without asking. You feel carried without effort. You begin to sense that something within you, yet greater than you, has taken over the activity of your life. This is the first taste of letting Christ live your life. This is the beginning of the inner shift. This is the dawn that precedes the full light of realization. And now, my friends, we enter the sacred territory where the spiritual life ceases to be theory and becomes experience. For when the personal sense of self grows quiet, when the mind relaxes its desperate grip upon life, something begins to take place within you, something subtle yet unmistakably real. It is the dawning of a new state of consciousness, the emergence of the Christ that has always been the truth of your being. This shift does not announce itself with fanfare. It does not come with lightning or excitement. It comes gently, so gently that the personal mind almost misses it. In fact, it is often recognized only in hindsight, when you look back and realize that something in you has changed, though nothing external seemed to bring about that change. The first sign is often a deep, unexplainable stillness. Not the stillness of inactivity, but the stillness of an inner atmosphere, quiet, spacious, luminous. A sense that something within you has stopped struggling. You may still have the same circumstances, the same challenges, the same responsibilities, but they no longer feel as heavy, as urgent, as threatening. Something within you has shifted from reaction to recognition. Then there arises a second sign, a clarity that does not come from thinking. You find that guidance emerges of itself. You know what to do without effort. You respond without premeditation. You speak words you did not plan. You take steps you did not analyze. And afterward, looking back, you say, I did not think of that. It was given. This is the activity of Christ in you, the divine intelligence expressing itself without the interference of the personal mind. A third sign appears in the form of effortless right action. Actions unfold without strain. Tasks you once resisted become smooth. Decisions that once paralyzed you become simple. This does not mean that life becomes free of events. It means that the events no longer dominate your inner equilibrium. There is a divine rhythm moving through your affairs, and you feel yourself carried by it. Then, without your trying, without your affirming, without your visualizing, there begins to emerge a loosening of fear, not because the circumstances have changed, but because something within you knows with quiet certainty that you are not living by your own power. Fear loses its foundation when the sense of separation dissolves. The Christ, being infinite presence, has no fear. And when Christ is allowed to live your life, fear fades like a shadow retreating before the morning light. And one day, you become aware of something even more subtle, a feeling that you are not the one doing the living. You are watching life unfold, watching the actions take place, watching the words form, watching the path open before you, and yet you know that these are not the products of personal striving. They are the expressions of a deeper self. This is the inner shift. This is the beginning of the life lived by the Spirit. This is what takes place when the Christ begins to assume its rightful place as the life, the mind, the activity of your being. You do not make this shift happen. You do not earn it. You do not control it. It arises naturally the moment the personal I steps aside, even slightly. The Christ that has always been present begins to show itself first gently, then steadily, then undeniably. And with each moment of recognition, the old identity grows weaker and the new identity grows clearer. This is the beginning of a life that is no longer lived for God, but from God, not for the purpose of gaining good, but as the expression of good, not as an effort to solve life, but as the revelation that life is already solved in God. Now, it is one thing to taste this inner shift in moments of meditation, in periods of stillness, in quiet hours when the world recedes. But what does it mean to live from Christ consciousness? To carry this awareness into the activities, the relationships, the responsibilities, and the challenges that make up daily living? For mysticism, true mysticism, is not an escape from life. It is the discovery of a higher life revealing itself through your ordinary life, a divine life expressing through human conditions, a spiritual rhythm moving through the most practical moments of your day. And so we begin by noticing what happens in our relationships. When Christ lives your life, you no longer approach others as personalities difficult, demanding, flawed, or admirable. Instead, you begin to sense that each one you meet is an appearance of the same divine presence that lives as you. You may still see their behavior. You may still notice their words, but you are no longer reacting to those surface elements. You are responding from a center of recognition, and in that recognition, the Christ in you beholds the Christ in them. This does not mean you condone unkindness or ignore injustice. It means you no longer meet darkness with darkness, personality with personality, fear with fear. You meet it with presence. You meet it with the awareness that only the Christ is real, and gradually you find your reactions softening, your words arising from compassion rather than defense, your interactions becoming less entangled in egoic patterns. Peace begins in the moment you cease defending the personal self. Then we look at work, at our daily tasks and responsibilities. When the personal mind governs your work, it becomes a burden. You push, you force, you calculate, you strain. But when Christ lives through you, your work becomes an avenue of expression for divine intelligence. Ideas appear without effort. Solutions arise before the problem fully forms. Actions flow naturally. You begin to notice that what you once dreaded now unfolds with ease, not because the task has changed, but because the doer has changed. Work under the personal self is labor. Work under Christ is flow. Work under the personal self is anxious striving. Work under Christ is inspired activity. Then we turn to the realm that troubles most people, finances and supply. When you live from the personal sense of self, money becomes a source of fear because you believe that it is supply. You believe that your well-being depends upon conditions, accounts, opportunities, or individuals. But when Christ's consciousness begins to live as you recognize that supply is not money. Supply is the activity of God appearing as form. Money becomes a channel, not a source. And because the source is infinite, the channels are endless. This does not mean that money mysteriously falls from the sky. It means that fear dissolves, because you no longer place your trust in the outer form. You trust the inner reality. And as fear dissolves, clarity arises. Opportunities unfold. Directions become obvious. You take steps you would not have considered before, not from desperation, but from inspiration. And you find that your needs are met not by struggling for them, but by recognizing that supply has always been spiritual. Then we consider health, another area where the personal self often trembles. The personal mind looks to the body and sees vulnerability, fragility, decline. It tries to fight symptoms, resist conditions, battle disease. But Christ consciousness does not fight disease. It does not oppose the appearance of illness. It simply rests in the truth that divine life is the only life, and that this life, being perfect, cannot express as imperfection. Healing, then, is not the correction of the body. It is the correction of identity. As you recognize yourself as the life of God, wholeness begins to reveal itself, not through conflict, but through recognition. This is what it means to live daily life from Christ consciousness. You do not withdraw from the world. You do not transcend responsibility. You do not float above daily experience. You remain in the world, but you are no longer of it. You move through life with a center that is not shaken by appearances. You speak from a depth that does not depend on circumstance. You act from a wisdom that is not your own. You love with a heart that is not personal. And gradually, your entire life begins to reorganize itself, not because you changed the outer world, but because you changed the level from which you live. This is the beginning of divine order expressing itself in your affairs. This is the beginning of a life lived not by effort, but by grace. Up to this point, everything we have spoken of may sound peaceful, harmonious, even beautifully simple. And indeed, the spiritual life is simple, divinely simple. But simplicity does not mean the personal mind will surrender without resistance. In fact, the moment you begin to shift your identity from the personal self to the Christ within, you will encounter certain misunderstandings, certain doubts, certain subtle forms of resistance that must be understood, not fought, not feared, but recognized for what they are. Let us speak first of impatience. The personal self has been conditioned for results. It lives by cause and effect. It measures, it judges, it evaluates progress. And so, when you begin to walk the spiritual path, that same tendency quietly enters your practice. You find yourself thinking, I have been seeking the presence for days, weeks. Why has nothing changed yet? But you see, the very question reveals the old consciousness at work. Christ does not come because you practice. Christ is revealed because the personal sense of self relaxes, and that relaxation cannot be hurried. It unfolds according to grace, not impatience. Then there is the desire to use Christ consciousness for personal gain. This is subtle. Perhaps you say, now that I know the truth, I will use it to heal this condition, to attract this supply, to resolve this problem. But the moment you attempt to use the Christ for a personal purpose, you have returned to the personal self, for the Christ has no personal purpose. The Christ is the presence of God, and God does not serve human will. Truth cannot be used. Truth can only be yielded to. So long as you try to make God act, you are still outside of the kingdom of God. Another resistance is doubt, especially when outer appearances seem unchanged. The personal mind looks at the world and says, if nothing has improved, nothing spiritual is happening. But remember, appearances are the last to change. Consciousness changes first, silently, invisibly, often without any emotional fireworks. When a seed is planted, nothing appears above the soil for some time, yet beneath the ground, life is already stirring. So it is with spiritual realization. The Christ often works in depths your mind cannot perceive, preparing the outer world for a shift that may seem sudden, but is the result of inner transformation long underway. There is also the temptation to fall back into effort, especially when life becomes challenging. You begin to feel the pressure of circumstances, and without noticing, you slip into the old patterns trying to fix. trying to plan, trying to force, trying to control. But this is the moment when you must be most watchful, most gentle with yourself, not scolding the mind, not condemning yourself for slipping, but simply returning quietly, humbly, to the awareness that Christ is living the life, not you. And perhaps the greatest resistance of all is the belief that you are unworthy. Many a sincere seeker says, surely this truth is for the advanced, the holy, the chosen. Surely I cannot expect such grace. But this thought is the final veil of the personal self. For the Christ in you has no sense of unworthiness. The Christ does not look at your past, your mistakes, your human frailties. The Christ knows only one thing: I and the Father are one. And when you hear that, even faintly, even for a moment, you are already beginning to transcend the old identity. The key is always the same. Do not fight the resistance. Do not argue with the mind. Do not attempt to conquer doubt or impatience or fear. Simply recognize them as movements of the personal self and let them pass. Return gently and again to the awareness that there is a presence within you greater than the mind, a presence that does not resist, does not fear, does not demand. A presence that knows how to live your life because it is your life. When resistance arises, it is not a sign of failure. It is the sign that the personal self senses its dissolution and clings to what is familiar, but it cannot endure. The light of Christ inevitably dissolves every shadow. And now we come to the heart of the mystical life, the summit toward which every step of the spiritual path has been leading. For all the practices, all the recognitions, all the moments of surrender are preparing you for one great realization, the realization expressed in the words, I live, yet not I. Christ liveth my life. These words, spoken by Paul, repeated by mystics across centuries, are not poetry. They are not metaphor. They are the literal description of what takes place when the false sense of self dissolves and the true self begins to shine unobstructed. You see, the personal I is never truly alive. It is a shadow, a concept, a bundle of conditioned thoughts. It cannot live because it has no life in it. But the Christ, the presence of God individualized as you, is life. And when the personal self yields, even for a moment, you begin to experience something astonishing. Life begins to live itself. Actions take place. Words are spoken. Steps are taken without the weight of self-consciousness, without the strain of personal will, without the burden of seeking results. The first time this happens, you may not even notice it. Perhaps you find yourself responding with kindness in a moment when the old self would have reacted with irritation. Perhaps you speak words of clarity that surprise even you. Perhaps you take an action that feels effortless, inevitable, guided, and afterward you realize, I did not do that. Something moved through me. That something is not foreign to you. It is your very self, your divine self, finally unobstructed by the noise of the personal mind. As this realization deepens, life begins to reorganize itself. You discover that inspiration comes before thought, guidance arises before planning, harmony appears before effort, and outcomes unfold without anxiety. This is not passivity. It is participation in a higher order of life. This is not the abdication of responsibility. It is the discovery of the true source of responsibility. This is not the loss of individuality. It is the unveiling of divine individuality. For when the Christ lives your life, something profound occurs. You no longer experience yourself as the center of existence. You experience God as the center and yourself as the expression of that center. You cannot explain this to the intellect. You cannot analyze it or pin it down. It is as if an inner door opens, and instead of you living your life, life capital L begins to flow through your being like a river moving through an unobstructed channel. You wake in the morning not with dread or duty, but with a quiet expectancy. What is the Father expressing today? You speak not to be understood or approved, but because the words arise naturally. You act not out of compulsion or pressure, but because the next step reveals itself effortlessly. And perhaps the most beautiful sign of this realization is the disappearance of fear, not because you are protected from harm, but because the one who feared no longer claims identity. Fear belongs only to the personal sense of self. The Christ has no fear, for it knows nothing exists outside of its own infinite presence. In this state, healing is no longer an event you seek. Healing is the inevitable consequence of abiding in wholeness. Supply is no longer something you chase. Supply is the natural expression of infinite abundance. Harmony is no longer a goal you work toward. Harmony is the inner order of divine life showing forth in form. You are no longer striving to become spiritual. You are realizing that you have never been anything else. I live, yet not I. That is the death of the false identity. Christ liveth my life. That is the birth of true individuality. This realization is not achieved through discipline or force. It is not the result of spiritual ambition. It comes quietly, naturally, inevitably, when you rest in the truth of your being, when you stop trying to think or feel your way into God and allow God to be the self that lives. And once you taste this truth, even briefly, you know without doubt, without argument, without explanation, that the personal self has never been your identity. The Christ has always been living your life. You simply did not recognize it. Now you begin to recognize it. Now you begin to live from it. Now you begin to understand that the life you call my life is God's life, appearing in a form that bears your name. This is the fullness of realization. And so, my friends, we come to the close of this particular message, though in truth there is no close, for the spiritual life has no beginning and no ending. It is the continuous unfolding of divine consciousness, the eternal revelation of the Christ within. What we have spoken of today is not something to be remembered, nor something to be practiced as a human being attempts a technique. It is something to be recognized quietly, gently, faithfully, in the depths of your own being. Everything you have ever sought, peace, supply, harmony, health, purpose, has been hidden only by one illusion, the belief that you were the one living your life. When that belief dissolves, even a little, the presence takes its rightful place, not as an addition to your life, not as a helper alongside your efforts, but as the very life itself. The Christ is not someone you invite, it is the reality you uncover. If there is one practice I would leave you with, it is simply this. Before you begin your day, before you check your phone, before you consider your tasks or responsibilities, take a moment, just a moment, and turn within, not to think something, not to repeat something, simply to acknowledge, Father, you are the life that is living me. Or if those words resonate differently for you, Christ is the only self I am. This recognition does not need force. It does not need belief. It requires only sincerity. One sincere moment of recognition carries more transformative power than hours of mechanical meditation. For when you acknowledge the presence, even briefly, you loosen the grip of the personal sense of self. You create an opening through which the Christ expresses itself more freely. Throughout the day, return again and again, not as a discipline, but as a remembering, a brief pause, a quiet breath, a gentle inner turning, just enough to recall that you are not the doer, not the thinker, not the one upholding your existence. You are the instrument through which the divine is expressing its infinite activity. And in time, without your effort, without your will, without your strain, you will discover that life has become different, not because circumstances have dramatically changed, but because you have changed. Your center has shifted from the personal to the universal. The false I has grown quieter. The true I, the Christ, has begun to take its rightful place. This is the grace of the spiritual path. This is the fruit of recognition, not the remaking of your life, but the revelation of your life as it truly is. God in expression, God as your consciousness, God as your being. May you come to see that the kingdom you have been seeking is already within you. May you feel the presence going before you, making the crooked places straight. May you rest in the assurance that the life you call mine is the infinite life of God. And may the Christ, the living presence within you, reveal itself more fully each day until you can say with complete inner certainty, I live, yet not I. Christ liveth my life.